Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of the Rethinking Church Virtual Summit. OMG, like we have had such a wonderful past 2 days, and I know that today is going to be just as great because any of you who know me know how passionate I am about social justice, advocacy, and evangelism. So today we have a full day just dealing with those topics. So want to give you guys a few announcements, and y'all know like my smoke detector needs changing, so just forgive me. First, check your mail. Check your mail. So the little icon with the mailbox, you might have people who are reaching out to you, who want to connect with you. So make sure that you are checking your mail in the system. Think tanks. If you are part of a think tank, I know we've had some hiccups with those, but don't worry, we're just getting started, and you all are just laying the groundwork for the work that we're going to do. So if you are a part of a think tank and you've identified a person who will present to us this afternoon, please message me the name of that person so that I can give them access to the stage so that you all can come and just share with us what your work will be. No more than 5 minutes, just give us like a synopsis of what you're interested in working on. We will also be announcing our grant awards this afternoon. So those of you who registered in advance, I think by June something, you were able to apply for one of 4 grants that we are awarding. And so this afternoon, Quinta will be announcing the recipients of our grants. So again, if you guys are wondering where your money went, why we couldn't have a paid event, this whole little platform that y'all are participating in and the grants are just among a few of the expenses that we had to cover. So thank you for your obedience and for your registrations. Don't forget, the Mental Health Day is tomorrow using the same platform, but it's a separate ticket. So you should have gotten an email yesterday with a link for you to get your ticket. Share, 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 because it is a free event. And like everybody's struggling with something right now. And we have therapists who are on tap who will be doing presentations and who will be connecting with you to help deal with those resources. So share with your network, share with your members, share with your ministries, get people to come on and be a part of that day. Yay, mental health. Dr. Catherine Jackson, who's been active all week, she's actually doing, you can have God and a therapist. So she's doing that session tomorrow. And then finally, our new announcement, our Voter Education Symposium, which will be our first official symposium to come out of this work, will be August 22nd. It will also be on this platform. It will be a free event, and you all will be able to hear from people around voter education, from why courts matter to redistricting to the 3 branches of government, because some people are kind of confused about how government works. So we need to clear all of that up before we get to November, because we don't want any confusion. We need y'all to understand why the Electoral College is important. Yes, we'd like to abolish it, but since we can't before November, we got to work with what we have. And so we want to make sure that everyone is on the same page about voter education and what and what the reality of politics looks like. So that's where we are. Quinta is going to introduce our speaker this morning. Oh my goodness. If you have not read any of his work, if you have not followed him on Facebook, then you are missing out. But you're in for a treat this morning to get to know Dr. Miguel De La Torre. So Quinta.
Good morning. Thank you, LaKesha. And as she said, we are excited about day 3. We're excited about all of the things that are to come. We're excited about the work from the think tanks, and we look forward to what will come in the future. I am especially excited about this morning, about our keynote speaker. I will probably be cheesing all day long because as I went through seminary down in Atlanta, his books were one of the ones that I kept close to me at all times. So I'm excited. If you've done any theological work around liberation and ethics, then you've likely crossed some of his writings, articles, his books, lectures. And so if you haven't, you need to go back. Okay, so I'm excited. And so I'm just going to give you can go and find his bio on the website, but I'm just going to give you a very short summary because it's a lot. He's done a lot. And so Dr. Miguel De La Torre, born in Cuba months before the Castro Revolution, he and his family came to the United States as refugees when he was 6 months old. For a while, the U.S. government considered him an illegal immigrant, asking him to self-deport in 1960. And so that certainly kind of gives you some background to where his thoughts come from. He's written numerous articles and books, including the award-winning Reading the Bible from the Margins, which is one of the first books that I read from him. Dr. De La Torre has been an expert commentator concerning ethical issues on several local, national, and international media outlets. A scholar activist, Dr. De La Torre has written numerous articles in popular media. He writes monthly columns for Baptist News Global, which continuously creates controversies for his unique approach of religiously analyzing social issues from the perspective of the disenfranchised. And so that's just a very short snippet of his background, but hopefully that kind of sets the stage of his work and what is to come. And so without further ado, I present to you Dr. Miguel De La Torre.
Gracias, gracias. I'm so honored and glad to be with you all today. I want to begin by, first of all, realizing that I am computer illiterate because I can't seem to find my notes. Ah, there they are. No, yeah. Let me tell it again. All white, enlightened, Eurocentric philosophical thought and movements are detrimental to communities of color. And I mean all. You see, when the French cried out during the revolution, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, they never intended to include the people from Vietnam, nor from Haiti, nor from Algiers. Liberty, equality, and fraternity was only for white French people. The colonized were not included in that equation. When I was a small boy in this country, and I would have to say every morning the Pledge of Allegiance, when I got to the phrase, and liberty and justice for all, even as a small boy, I knew that that did not apply to those of us who were Latinx. So we are forced to live under a structure that speaks of liberation and equality and liberty, but yet it doesn't apply to everyone. So why should I embrace that type of thinking when it is automatically designed to exclude me? And the way it excludes me is that we create these very abstract, cerebral thoughts in where we think theology and ethics are these very complex ideas beyond our comprehension, when in reality, we make it abstract, we make it difficult, just to be sure to exclude other people. What white theology is guilty of is that it has made the Eurocentric subjectivity objective for everyone else, for the rest of the world. So if my desire is truly liberation, then I have to reject this Eurocentric philosophical and theological way of seeing the world that universalizes the Eurocentric view for everyone else. And I want to begin by giving an example and looking at someone like Hegel. And I don't want to get too much into philosophical thought, but for those of you who are familiar with Hegel, he gives us the metaphysical historical dialectic. And what that means is that for Hegel, history moves in stages. It's a narrative story. And for him, it begins in the East, and it makes its way to the most developed the most civilized group of people, which for him happens to be the German Anglo-Saxons in the heart of Europe. Surprise, surprise. But as the spirit of the world moves towards the most civilized, it totally ignores Africa, Asia, Native Americans in the so-called New World, and as well as Spain, which was considered barbaric because of the conquest of 700 years. In other words, these areas are outside of the movement of history because of their inferiority. They only really entered history when white Europeans first interact with these individuals. This becomes what has been known as the white man's burden, to civilize and Christianize the barbarians. So Hegel, from the very beginning of his historical movement of time, on which a lot of us base our worldview, automatically is designed to exclude us. This idea of a salvation history, and by salvation history, I'm not talking about the Christian concept that we're all going to go to heaven at the end, but rather the salvation history is a history that things move from what is chaotic and uncivilized in an upward trajectory to something that's more civilized and something that's more advanced. So it's an upward movement of history. This idea of salvation history, which Hegel gives us, is picked up by people like Karl Marx and Adam Smith. So both Marxism and capitalism are really twins of modernity that believes history is leading us to something that is going to be superior and better. The only difference is the means of who owns production. But here's the problem with having this worldview. And here I believe I drank the Foucault Kool-Aid. And that is, history is probably not linear. That is, this idea that history moves in a linear upward fashion, it's really a construction that we impose upon the movement of time. So rather than history having meaning and purpose, that somehow we're moving towards something that's going to be better. History can do that, but history can also move towards something that's going to be worse. The future may be better, but we could have another Holocaust. We could have another Middle Ages. I mean, there is no guarantee that it's all going to work out in the future. And that's the argument I'm trying to make. And here, I think I depart from people like Martin Luther King Jr., who says that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I would argue that the arc of the universe, it's not only not moral, but it really could care less which way it's going to bend. We can have a better future, or it could just be a horrific future. Now, before I really get into this, I want to take a step back and confront my own complicity with my own oppression. In other words, my mind is so colonized that I learned to see reality through the eyes of white theologians and philosophers. And let me give you an example. When I was in my early 20s, back in the 80s, when my hair was down to my collar and I had this really neat red sports car, a Mercury Capri, I drove up to New York City from Miami. And as I was driving up north, I get pulled over in New Jersey. And when I got pulled over, I remember asking the cop, why? And because I was only going like 3 or 4 miles above the speed limit. I wasn't speeding. And his comment was, well, young Latino men with Dade County license plates, Dade County is Miami, are suspected of bringing cocaine up to New York City. This was during the years of the cocaine cowboy wars. So we just stopped to make sure. And they searched my car. They didn't find anything, thank goodness. But as I was driving away, more outrageous than being stopped for driving under the influence of being a Latino, more outrageous was what went through my mind, which was, at least the cops are doing their job and keeping us safe. You see, rather than being outraged, my mind was so colonized that I was seeing myself through the eyes of my oppressors. I was seeing myself the way this police officer was seeing me. So the first act of liberation has to be the decolonization of my own mind. And that doesn't only include how I see myself, it also includes how I learn to see the world around me. So when I learn history, when I learn ethics, when I learn theology, from those who profit from my marginalization, that really becomes blasphemous, because I am participating in the colonization of my own mind. So when the Eurocentric faith of Christianity embraces the concept of hope, I have to become suspicious. Is hope a way of domesticating me? And we're going to go into this in more detail. But I have to be suspicious of all the theological propositions that I have been taught in my Eurocentric seminaries. I need to learn not just spiritual liberation, which is what I mostly was taught, but also physical liberation. Believing that the riches is not just for the hereafter, but for the here and now. And I get the idea that God vomits because of my colonized mind. Jose Marti, who is my intellectual mentor, he lived in the end of the 19th century. He once said, "El vino de plátano, y si sale agrio, sigue siendo nuestro vino." And for those of you who have yet learned the language of the angels, let me translate. We shall make our wine out of plantain, and even if it comes out sour, it is still our wines. So the first step of liberation is, like I said, the decolonization of my own mind. That is, how do I make my wine out of my own cultural symbols, my plantains, the food of my people? And it doesn't matter if it tastes sour, because it's mine. And I guess what I'm trying to propose today is, how do we make our theology? How do we learn to see the world around us using our own symbols? And even if we get it wrong, it's still better than the symbols of those who wants us to domesticate ourselves. How do we learn to see with our own eyes? And I would say that the first step is I have to reject all Eurocentric, philosophical, and theological supremacist views. So how do I do this? Basically contextual. That is, it has to be grassroots. And maybe a quick disclaimer. If my views are celebrated by the dominant culture that wishes to domesticate my people, then I'm doing something wrong. If my theology and my ethics is embraced by those who benefit from the marginalization of my people, then I have to wonder how much is my voice colonized. And what I'm saying right now, and I have no idea who's out in the audience, unfortunately, unlike being here in person, I can't look out. But if there are white people listening to me today, please understand that what I'm saying is not really meant for you. I'm speaking really to communities of color. I'm glad that you're hearing these words, but it's not for you. In a way, you're overhearing a conversation that's going on within a community of color, and you have the privilege of listening into this conversation. And if you agree, great, and if you don't agree, it doesn't matter to me, because you're not the audience right now. The audience that I want to speak to is the African American community, the Latinx community, the Asian American community, the queer community, the communities that are oppressed and repressed. So I talked about Hegel. I talked about seeing through the eyes of my oppressors. And the concept that I want to talk about now that I have to question is this idea of hope. And I began to have a problem with hope when I took a group of students to Cuernavaca, Mexico. And the purpose of the trip was to have the students interrogate people living in shantytown, in squatter communities, about God, and to understand how our privilege in the first world is interconnected to the privilege in to the misery and the oppression of the global South. And I took a group of basically white freshmen and sophomore college students. And while we were there, it was a horrible, it's horrible to be involved and to see such poverty. And afterwards, as the professor, my job is to unpack what we saw and try to make sense of it. And during that evening, during the conversation among the students, I'll never forget, one particular student said, it really is horrible what we saw. It's really terrible how these people have to live. But when I looked into the eyes of the little girl, I saw the hope in her eyes. And at that point, I'll be honest with you, I had an epistemological meltdown, because what the student was doing was disengaging from the misery of the oppressed by placing it into the hands of God, that somehow God will take care of this. And because there is hope, this particular student didn't have to do anything. So hope becomes a middle-class excuse to do nothing. As long as I have hope that, those people will somehow survive, then it's in God's hands. I have hope it's going to happen. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to change how I live. I don't have to change how I act, because I believe in hope. Now, I realize that when I critique hope, I'm going literally against one of the gifts of the spirits. What is it? Love, joy, peace, and hope. All things work for good for those who love God and are called according to God's purposes. Romans 8:28. But you see, one of the problems that I have is that when I read that verse, I'm reading it in English. Because in Spanish, the word for hope, esperanza, is from the word esperar, which means to wait. So in Spanish, when we say tener esperanza, to have hope, also means to be able to wait. And what we wait for, we're not sure if it's going to be good or bad. There's a certain ambiguity in Spanish to the word hope. And if I'm going to make my wine out of my own plantains, that means I must also make my wine out of my own language and include in this concept of hope that ambiguity. I'm sure if any of you have pastored a church or have gone to church, you heard the minister say the story about the little girl at the beach after this horrible storm. And the beach is full of starfishes, and she's there throwing all the starfishes back into the ocean. And there's this grumpy old man who's seen the little girl throwing the fishes back, and he yells out at her, "You're not going to be able to save them all." And the little girl picks up one and says, yeah, but I'll make a difference in this one, and throws it into the ocean. And we all go, ah, what a beautiful story. Well, you see, I'm the grumpy old man, to be honest with you. And the problem is with the story is that we have reduced hope to the individual. So as long as one starfish, one individual makes it, then hope works. And in that process, we ignore all the other thousands of starfishes that are dead and dying on the beach because we focus on the individual, on the one. And let me bring this home. I grew up in the barrios of New York, in a slum building that had one bathroom per floor that was occupied by drug addicts and pimps. It was really, it was a roach rat infested tenement building. I made it out of the barrio, and I got my doctorate, and I'm a respected professor. So if you hold me up and say, look, that Latino made it out of the barrio, see, we could have hope, that ignores the thousands of other Latinos who never made it out of the barrios, who, like the starfish, have died and have been buried way before their time. So by individualizing hope, what we do is that we excuse and ignore the vast majority who continue to perish because of the structures in which we live in. Let me get back to Hegel. So Moltmann, embracing Hegel, and Moltmann, for those of you who may not know, he writes a book called The Theology of Hope, which is a very groundbreaking instrumental book in how we do theology today. So Moltmann, using Hegel, basically say that God stands outside of history. For him, God is a process God. And because God stands outside of history, God doesn't know how the story ends, but in spite of that, God makes promises that the end is going to work out. So we can trust God because God keeps God's promises. Tell that to the Jews at Auschwitz. Primo Levi, who was at Auschwitz, realized that God failed to keep God's promises. In fact, he writes, there is no God, only Auschwitz. And what he's trying to remind us is, how do you do liberation when God does not show up? How do we trust in this hope when we're all going to die in the gas chambers? And see, this really brings it down to earth. Now, Moltmann would say, yeah, but when we get to the end of history, we can look back and see in all those points of horror that God was present. I'm sure you saw the poem or about the footprints in the sands, and there was 2 pairs of footprints, and then there was only one, and that's when Jesus was carrying you. And that sounds so poetic, but in the reality is that when I look back into history, or when I look at the beach and only see one set of footprints, and say, well, it all worked out so I could rejoice, I can't, because no matter how much I try to justify history, I can never justify the Holocaust. I can never justify slavery. I could never justify the genocide of indigenous people because of the conquistadores. In other words, these horrors cannot simply be swept away at the end of history and just simply say, well, God kept God's promises. The stench of too many corpses chokes my ability to accept the world's brutality as a necessity for God's plans to work out. This is why I say that the movement of time, this thing called history, does not care about my liberation. You notice how every once in a while Jesus appears in a tortilla someplace? Every so often you read a story about someone cooking a tortilla and the face of Jesus appears on the bread. In a way, that's what we do with history. History is this chaotic, non-linear, non-connected points of time and events that is pure chaos. So what we try to do is impose order on the chaos. There was a study done in Korea in where an individual was asked to look at static images. That's an image that just has a bunch of dots or lines. And then they were asked, do you see a face in it? And usually they did see a face, even though there was no face design in that static image. And I'm sure you've done the same thing. Have you ever seen like marble that has a lot of different grooves in it? If you look closely, you might actually make out a face. That is our minds trying to put order into chaos. And I would argue that seeing Jesus in a tortilla is the same as trying to see the hand of God in history, that somehow history is moving according to God's plan. What I'm arguing is what the writer of Ecclesiastes argued: vanities of vanities, absolute futility, everything is meaningless. To be a Christian of color in this country means that Romans 8:28 of all things working out becomes hollow in the oppression that people of color in this country have suffered under for generations. And what hope does is that it domesticates us. When I went to Auschwitz, and when you walk into Auschwitz, there's a sign that says, work will set you free, over the gate, the entrance gates. That was a lie. Work did not set anybody free. And the vast majority of the people who walked through those gates ended up in the crematory. But you see, if I was walking through those gates and I was to read that sign, it would give me enough hope that if I keep my head down, if I don't do anything radical, I might be able to save my life and I might be able to be set free. Hope is a dangerous thing for oppressed people because it domesticates them so they do nothing to overturn the tables at the temple that are designed for their oppression. To be anti-hope is to be in radical solidarity with those who have no hope in a future, and to sit with them in the dust and provide visions that it's all going to work out really is cruel, really is insensitive. My people, my community lives in the Saturday after Friday's crucifixion and no idea if there's going to be a Sunday resurrection. My children in cages in the border live in the radical Saturday of hopelessness. And how cruel for me to show up at Tornillo, where you have one of these concentration camps, and just walk in and tell these kids, don't worry, it's all going to work out, when they may die or where they're separated from their parents. Hope domesticates. And if we want liberation, we must crucify hope. And I have to ask the theological questions that make me uncomfortable. The first being, where is God in the midst of my oppression? Or as Jesus would say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And of course, theologians quickly come up with this idea that, well, Jesus is all sin right now and God can't look upon sin. So Jesus felt as though he was abandoned by God. And that sounds nice, but you know what, God can't look at sin? I mean, really? I mean, that is really theologically grasping for straws. We have to realize that God could be sometimes a bit sadistic. I mean, have you read the story of Job? You know, God and Satan make a bet to see that they could break Job and make Job curse God. And so they, you know, kill his entire family. They give him all these illnesses, take away all his wealth. And at the end of the story, when you're hoping for an answer, God finally just says, I do whatever the hell I want, and tough. That's problematic for me. You see, one thing that Christians have lost, but within the Hebrew God continues to be maintained by our Jewish brothers and sisters, is that God has a dark side. Isaiah says, if good and evil visits a city, isn't that I, God, who send it? So they have to hear this. According to Isaiah, God sends good and evil to a city. Or think about this. God sends evil spirits unto Saul. What does it mean that God sends evil spirits to a human? So you see, to protect God from God, we have to create a Satan. Okay, so I'm saying that it's hopeless. I'm saying that sometimes God is so beyond my comprehension that it seems as though God is not there with me during my time of need and is not there to liberate me. What then becomes the response of the Christian who follows this God who is beyond understanding or comprehension? I would say that we need to embrace a badass Christianity. We need to realize that hopelessness rejects quick fixes. Now, Womack would tell us that to be hopeless is to be in despair. And I think that's a horrible definition of hopelessness. Hopelessness is not despair. Hopelessness is desperation. And there's a difference between the two words. In despair, I roll up into the fetus position and I gnash my teeth and I feel horrible and I weep and I cry. Desperation, on the other hand, is the realization that things are so bad that I am going to die if I stay. So I'm going to go ahead and cross this desert and be an immigrant in a new land. And I may also die crossing the desert, or I may end up in a cage if I get to the other side of the River Jordan. But the desperation of staying is so great that the hopelessness propels me to actions that could be just as bad. And this is the thing about oppressed people. There is no choice between what's good and what's bad. It's only a choice between what's bad and what's worse. And that is what makes the situation so hopeless. Miguel De La Torre, which was the philosopher of the early 20th century, writes a prayer to the God who may not be there. And see, what Unamuno tries to explain is that it's not so much important if you believe that there is a God which exists. What's more important is to live as though there is a God that exists. And I think part of the Eurocentric theological dilemma is we're too busy trying to prove God, rather than realizing that we don't know if there is a God, but I'm going to live my life as though there is. You see, in a very real way, this is what faith is. Faith is believing when there's no reason to believe. Faith is believing in that which cannot be proven to exist. But Eurocentric theology forces us to try to prove God's existence. I don't know if there's a God. And it doesn't matter. I live my life as though there is, and that is what faith is. See, I don't seek answers that lead me to correct doctrines as to why my people suffer. I seek correct actions, correct praxis that I can employ, fully aware of the injustice that correct actions may not fix. See, I fight for justice not because I think I'm going to win. I probably will not win. I don't fight for justice because I'm going to get an extra ruby in my crown when I get to heaven. I fight for justice because it defines my humanity and it defines my Christian faith. If neoliberalism has won, if oppression continues, if indeed we have lost, then I have to ask, do we continue to struggle for justice because you think you're going to win, or do you struggle for justice because it defines who you are? Do you struggle for justice because you have no other choice? Because not to do so negates everything you are and everything you believe. Now, I know this hopelessness may sound like something horrible, but in a way, it's very liberating. You notice how many people enter into social movements and then they quickly burn out? And I would argue they burn out because they think they could actually change the world. And when the world gets worse, then they give up. I've been fighting for immigration rights now for almost 20 years. And it's worse now than it was 20 years ago. And it may be another 20 years and nothing probably will change. But you see, I'm not fighting because I think I'm going to change our immigration policies. We may, and if we do, great. But if we don't, I have no choice but to continue fighting for justice because that's who I am. Privilege means you can walk away from the fight. You could walk away from the struggle. Economic privilege, race privilege means that you don't have to continue fighting for justice. You could just stop. But for those of us who have skin in the game, who has a dog in the fight, we can never walk away. So what is the ethical response? Right now, we have to go to the police department to get a permit from the police department to protest the police department for police brutality. We have to follow the rules. I remember once I had a conversation when I was in Mexico with a Zapatista rebel. And he told me the story. He said that when they tried to take away his land, he went to the bureaucrats to try to argue with them about, not taking away his land. And they basically looked at him and they said, you smelly Indian, get out of here. So he showed up the next day, he said, with a bandana over his face and carrying an AK-47. And he said, an interesting thing happened. They listened to me. We had a very meaningful conversation. In other words, if I follow the rules, nothing will change. Because the rules who are designed by those who benefit from my oppression are designed in such a way to provide me with satisfaction that I'm protesting, but actually changes nothing. We are the only country where you can drive to a march. You have to think about that. I could literally I could go protest, carry my sign, feel good about myself, and go home, and nothing changes. So following the rules does not work. What we need is what I have been calling an ethics para joder. Now, for those of you who know Spanish, I apologize for the usage of my language, but joder is a certain word that you never use in polite conversation. It's similar to a certain four-letter word in English that begins with F and ends with K. This is an ethics that screws with the structures. It overturns the tables at the temple. And I get this from the Young Lords. The Young Lords was a turf gang in Chicago and New York City that basically most of their leadership went to prison, and in prison they got revolutionized. And when they came out, they made the Young Lords into an activist group. And let me just share one thing that they did. In New York City, they went ahead and they cleaned up the streets in the barrio, in Spanish Harlem, and they put all the garbage in bags and they put them on the street corners, and they called the sanitation department and say, please pick up the garbage. Sanitation department kind of laughed at them and says, yeah, we'll go whenever we feel like it. Because at that time, in communities of color, the sanitation only showed up whenever they had extra time. So they took those garbage bags, they went to 3rd Avenue, they built a 5-foot wall, and they set it on fire during rush hour traffic. They were screwing with the system. And what happened, of course, the cops came, beat them up, threw them in jail. But also the New York Times showed up and began running stories on the sanitation department. And the exposure of how the sanitation department worked made radical changes, and now they pick up garbages on Tuesdays and Fridays. Now, did it change oppression in Spanish Harlem? Did it radicalize the entire community? No, but it did move us closer to something a little bit more just. And it moved us not because the Young Lords protested, but because they began to screw with the system. The other thing they did, they went to the church, La Primera Iglesia Metodista in Spanish Harlem, and they talked to the pastor about having a breakfast for kids on their way to school, morning breakfast, having lawyers there to help people with the legal issues, a food bank, a clothes bank, and the pastor looked at them and says, you commies, get out of here. So they showed up on Sunday, and they picked up the pastor, and they threw him out of the church. They nailed a sign to the church in red letters calling it the People's Church, and they began to do all these things. And the church was full of the community coming now to church. About 3 weeks later, the cops came, threw him out, threw him in jail. And unfortunately, the church stopped being the People's Church. But again, they were screwing with the system. They were basically holding institutions, government and church, liable to the rhetoric that they say they believe in. Now, I get this not only from the Young Lords, but I also get this from El Egua. Again, if I'm going to make wine out of my own indigenous roots, one of them is the Afro-Cuban religion known as Santeria, in where the Orishas from Africa were worshipped and in Cuba and became part of a Christian expression. And one of the Orishas is El Egua, who happens to be my Orisha. And El Egua is the trickster. And the trickster always looks for opportunity within chaos. And the trickster creates chaos in the hopes that opportunities may arise that may lead to something better, or it could lead to something worse. We don't know. So I want to end here and by saying that the ethics that I am trying to engage in is one that non-violently lies in order to discover what is true, that cheats in order to bring justice, that steals so that we can feed the hungry. How do you do what the dominant culture has said is sinful in an ethical manner so that we can move closer to something that's just? How do I joke? How do I disrupt? How do I deceive so that the justice of God can begin to appear within such an unjust social structure? I think I'll end there. And I think we could do some questions if you want. I think we have some time. And someone's going to help me. Yes.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So I know you weren't monitoring the chat, but you have just like blown everyone's mind, and you're actually challenging worldviews. Like that is something that we have actually been talking about through this whole concept of hopelessness, and just what does that mean? There was one question that I definitely would like for you to address, and it says, is God sadistic, or did the ancient writers cast their sadism onto God?
I have no idea whatsoever. And I think that's the whole point. When you read the biblical text, you could make an argument for either one of those sides. Obviously, there are some problems with God. And, you know, when you read some of the things of, you know, like some of the laws, like it says, one of the laws is if your kids disrespect you, you are to put them to death. Now, as a father who used to have teenage kids, I kind of liked that idea for a while. But obviously, I'm not about to follow God's dictates on what to do with kids. So is that humans placing unto God their views, or is God actually saying this? I don't know. I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm not a theologian, and I really don't care, because that doesn't really deal with the kids who are dying right now in our prison systems. So rather than having those type of theological questions, discussions, which is great if I have the privilege of whiteness to sit around in an armchair and have these great discussions as to the nature of God, I'm more interested in how do I represent God on earth among the oppressed. That's really where we need to be putting our focus. And all these other discussions, they're interesting, they're fun, but they don't change our structures of oppression. And that's where I want to keep the focus on.
Wonderful. Another question, what are some steps to be taken to decolonize the minds of congregants? Because a lot of our churches, like, essentially are founded on the preaching and teaching of hope, which, as you said, is a part of basically our oppression, because we sit and wait and we're hoping that things will get better. So how do we start to shift that mindset to a mindset that is more focused on justice and action?
Yeah. Well, if you're talking about congregants, you're talking about church, very carefully. Let's be honest. We're talking. I'm advocating something that goes against traditions of hundreds of years. So we need to be. We need to bring people along. One way of doing it, I strongly believe, which is very rooted in not only the Latinx culture, but I know also in the African American culture and the indigenous culture, is storytelling, and the Asian American culture is storytelling. The telling of stories, the telling of our stories. And when we tell our stories, it begins to show some of the contradictions between how we're living our lives and the ideals of what we say our theology is. And that's okay for there to be that conflict. I mentioned Miguel De La Torre earlier, and one of the things that he said, which I loved, is, you say that I contradict myself. Well, of course I do. I'm human. All humans contradict themselves. The biblical text is contradictory. That's what makes it beyond our comprehension. That's why we have to struggle with it. So no, I would say that definitely telling our stories, but not only just telling our stories, reading the writings of our scholars. There were many African-American, Latinx, Asian Americans, queer scholars who have written really earth-shaking books. And yet we still focus on the white scholars that we learn at seminary. We really need to reject that and move away from that and struggle with what our people are struggling with and move beyond our cul-de-sac. So as a Latino, I need to be reading the writings of African American and Asian American and Indigenous to challenge my own biases with those groups, just like you all need to be reading the works of people who are also oppressed in other communities.
That's so wonderful. And I think that that's something that we don't often do is, I know like I haven't read very many works outside of my context. And I think for us to truly have that understanding, we do have to step outside of our circle so that we can just glean from others. So another question that we had is, how do you how do you personally decolonize? Like, what was that process like for you once you recognize, like, whoa, like I need to start with myself first. Like, what does that process look like? And what are some steps that we can take to begin that work personally?
Yeah, I mean, after over half a century, I'm nowhere close to have decolonized my mind. Let me put it this way. I refer to it kind of like being a recovering racist. No matter how much I try, I could never stop being racist because I have a lighter skin pigmentation. The structures are designed to privilege me. I may be an ally on issues, anti-racist issue, but at the end of the day, I have been so trained on how to take advantage of my lighter skin pigmentation that is easy to constantly fall off the wagon. That's why I say I'm a recovering racist. I'm a recovering sexist. It doesn't matter how much I may believe in equal pay and, you go sisters. At the end of the day, I'm still, society is going to be sexist for me. It's going to be racist for me. So part of the decolonization process is, how do I stand in solidarity with those who are on my margins? Even as a Latino, I'm definitely on the margins of this culture, but even in, it's not just oppressed and oppressors. Even among the oppressed, there are structures of oppression, issues of colorism, issues of homophobia. How do we stand with those who are oppressed within our margins? And as we learn from those of whom those who are oppressed because of our complicity with the structures that are oppressive for us, as we learn from them, then we begin to decolonize our mind.
Wow, that's a serious work, because I don't think we often recognize our complicity within our own systems, which classism is one, because some of us have privilege to live in different neighborhoods. And so we look at people who don't live in those neighborhoods in a different way, not recognizing how that is contributing to their oppression. So yeah, we have a lot of work to do, y'all. We have another question. Are white evangelical churches to be held accountable for the oppressive structures which perpetuate white supremacy? And do you do any work with white churches? Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think right now, the bastion of white supremacy within religious circles is found within white evangelical churches. And just look at who voted for whom in 2016 and who is supporting whom in 2020, and I rest my case. They definitely must be held accountable. And in fact, I have a book coming out in January called Decolonizing Christianity, Becoming Badass Christians. Oh no, Becoming Badass Believers. And in that book, I basically take on the evangelical movement and tie it to the upcoming race wars that they are complicit in wanting to engage in. It's a follow-up to an earlier book I wrote called Burying White Privilege that came out a couple of years ago.
Awesome. All right, next question. Many of our young people are questioning the idea of colonization and how it has impacted our thinking of God and the universe as a whole. What can we do as leaders in the church to help engage in these conversations in a meaningful way?
Yeah. I would say for me, and I can't speak for everyone else. Well, first of all, let me also give a word of warning. I was a pastor and I was kicked out of my pastorate because of the stuff I was doing. So I may not be the best person to ask these questions. because I held my white congregation accountable to their racism very rigorously. But it seems to me that, if I learned from that experience, was that rather than telling our white congregants why they're racist, it is to instead ask a lot of questions of what they say they believe with the reality of what's going on. This also helps understand, used for communities of color. And Nestor Cardenas writes a book, and the name of the book will come to me. But basically, it's just a collection of Bible studies that he did in Nicaragua, and he had his recorder going. And hopefully somebody will remember the title of the book and would write it down and let you know, so you could let me know what it was. I can't think of it right now. But basically, these were campesinos, limited education. So, these weren't scholars, and they read a Bible story, and then they began to, discuss it based on what was going on in their life as campesino being oppressed. And the process, number one, the Spirit of God definitely spoke there more than any other elitist church I've ever been to, because it made the word come alive in their lives, and it was very educational. And definitely, I'm sorry, the name is blank. It's the name of the town of where these Bible studies were held. But Ernesto Cardenas, that's a good model on how to do this in your church.
So many are asking about a book list. Do you have a book list like on your website or somewhere where we can access some of the things that you're reading or that you recommend us to read for this work?
I would say that when you find a book that really speaks to you, and this is what I do, I look at the footnotes and see who the author is quoting, who is the author engaging. So for example, if you were to read any of my books, you would find that my conversation partners, the people that I mostly am talking to in my footnotes, are people like James Cone, people like Tink Tinker, people like Stacey Floyd Thomas. These are the people that really, people like Tony Pinn. These are the people who are influencing me and I'm speaking with in my footnotes. And of course, and then the philosophers, people like Jose Marti and Miguel de Unamuno as well. So I would say definitely find a book that just blew your mind, and then follow the footnotes and see who is influencing this author, and this way you can create your own book list. For those interested in my own books, on my website, I published about 40 books, if I'm not mistaken. So you could find a few there that might interest you.
So I have a personal question. Like, how do you get the inspiration to write on these topics? Like, where do you find your inspiration?
I guess before my conversion, I'll use good old evangelical language. I was a right-wing fundamentalist evangelical. So I was part of the structures of institutionalizing the violence towards communities of color. I was very complicit. So personally, I feel like since then, a lot of my work is trying to undo a lot of the damage that I originally was complicit in doing, not just theologically, but also I was also very active in politics. I ran political campaigns for right-wing fascists in the past. So this is kind of like my penitence, to say the least. So at first I began to really work within my own community, but then I began to realize that if I'm truly going to be a liberationist, I am a liberation theologian. If I'm truly going to be a liberationist, that means I have to stand in solidarity with anyone who's oppressed, not just the people from my own community. And every time I read a newspaper, it's like there's so many new groups that I haven't even thought about that I have to somehow stand in solidarity with. So when I say that, for me, it doesn't matter if I'm going to win. It doesn't matter if I'm going to go to heaven. It doesn't matter if there is a heaven. I do this because I have no other choice. It's what defines my very being.
So tell us about like the conversion. So how did you go from being like this right-wing, like fascist supporting to like embracing liberation? Like how did that conversion happen for you?
Well, I decided, it's interesting because I ran for political office as a right-wing Republican conservative. I lost the election. I had a business. I had a real estate company. I mean, you can't be more capitalist than that. So I decided to go to seminary, and I went to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And my idea was I was going to get my MDiv, I was going to become a minister, and then later, with my ministry, go ahead and get back into politics and save the U.S. for Jesus. This is back in the late 80s when the Save America movement was very strong. As a matter of fact, I was part of the Pat Robinson ticket when I ran for office. So while at seminary, as I was going to class, we were reading Karl Barth, and we were reading Bultmann, and we were reading all these German names, and none of it made sense to me. It was like reading from a different world. So I went ahead to the library and I pulled out every book that had a Latino sounding name, not knowing who Gustavo Gutierrez was, not knowing who John Saldino was, not knowing who Osman was, not knowing who these liberation theologians were. I didn't know them. I didn't know who the Buff brothers were. And I started reading them. And as I read them, it brought back my life experience of growing up in poverty and the scars that I've had as occupying a Latino body in this country. And it made sense to me. It actually came alive, and slowly, and I'm talking slowly, it took like a 3-year conversion process, I moved to becoming more and more of a liberationist. By the time I finished my seminary education, there wasn't any Baptist church that would hire me as a minister. So I did what every unemployed master's student does. I went ahead and got my PhD. And in the process, the rest became history. I, really got into liberation theology, and I really got into understanding critical race theory and postmodern and postcolonial thought, and then I dedicated my life to that kind of work.
Wow. So our last question, I know you guys don't want this to end, but our last question is, what is your understanding of the Great Commission based on the work that you've done?
Yeah. In your going out, preach the gospel. I think, number one, we misinterpret that. We read as go out and preach the gospel. A better translation from the Greek is in your going out. As you are moving in the world, preach the gospel. And the way I preach the gospel, and I really, Francis of Assisi is supposed to have said, we don't know if he actually said it, but I'm going to assume he did, but he's supposed to have said, preach the gospel in every opportunity you have, and when all else fails, then open your mouth. And I think the problem that we have is that we read that verse and we think we have to go out and try to convince people to believe what I believe. That is, to make the non-believer into a believer. I read that as making the non-person into a person. Those who are denied their personhood, the good news is that they are a person before God. So how do I preach their humanity so that they can become person? What they believe doesn't matter to me, because when we get to heaven, we're all going to find out how wrong all of us were anyway. What's important is that when people look at the tree, they see the fruits. And by the fruit, you will be known. So for me, the Great Commission for me is going out, making non-persons into persons, and letting them see the fruit on my tree so they know who I am and what I believe. And if they want to talk about that, great. And if they don't, that's fine as well, because what's important is liberation. Not so much from my individual sins, which is very Eurocentric, but liberation from the sins of society that creates all these oppressive structures.
That is such a beautiful way to look at it. And honestly, like just like you're expressing that, like gives me a sense of peace that my work is not to save the world, but my work is to help people who seek liberation to find liberation and to validate that they are worthy of that liberation, that I don't have the power to determine who should live free and who should be free, that we should all be free. So, wow. So finally, what last thought would you like to leave for us as we're rethinking this whole concept of church, ministry, discipleship? What last words do you have for us to do this work?
I would say don't follow the rules. I mean, seriously, the rules are designed to maintain oppressive structures. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean as an individual I don't follow the rules, because then I could justify all types of horrible things. But it means that as a community, we need to think creatively. What's going on in Oregon right now, I think is jodiendo. It's what I'm talking about, where moms are coming out with posters saying, okay, federal government, go to your room. I mean, I love that. That's screwing with the system. When you have mothers and grandmothers in the front lines, chastising the federal government for being children. I mean, it's screwing with the system, and that's very, very creative. How do we begin to be creative in how we try to bring about justice? Because if we follow the rules, nothing will change.
Well, I have to tell you, you have truly blessed us. I've been watching the chat and just like the conversations. I'll send you a copy so that you can kind of see the impact that your presentation has had on us this morning. So thank you so much for taking time out of your morning, because it's earlier where you are than it is for us. But thank you so much for accepting this invitation and for being in dialogue with us today. We are so grateful, and you have no idea the impact that you've had through your words. And I have a feeling like you're going to see a lot of book sales coming through because and that's one of the things that, I'm hoping to do through our group is to do some book discussions. So prayerfully, you will come back and discuss one of your books through one of our book discussions, and we will have read it and be able to dialogue with you about your work. So yes, thank you so much. So thank you all for tuning in. You guys have about 15 minutes to take a break before our sessions begin.